From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, August 7th, 2015. 50 years after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, we'll speak with Nation writer Ari Berman about his new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. And Ramona Africa joins us in studio. She is the sole survivor of the Philadelphia bombing of the Move House 30 years ago. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. Hundreds of people have been kidnapped by the Islamic State in Syria's Homs province, a day after the militant group captured the town of Al-Qaryatain. The 230 people estimated to have been captured are Christians, many of whom escaped to Homs to avoid violence in Aleppo. ISIS claims it has kidnapped those people accused of collaborating with the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad. The mass abduction comes just a day after a mosque in Saudi Arabia was bombed, killing 15 people and injuring many others. The mosque was near the Saudi border with Yemen, and ISIS has also claimed responsibility for that attack, which is thought to have been carried out by a suicide bomber. Well, Chenjerai, clearly ISIS is capable of operating on many fronts all at once and have escalated their attacks more than a year after they emerged on the scene. How effective can the U.S. and other countries be in simply fighting back militarily?
I think this is the right question. You know, the disproportionate focus on military strategies, I think is part of how we wound up in this mess to start out with. We destabilize regions and create all kinds of, conditions that make it easier for people to recruit people into these terrorist activities. And so all intelligent commentators on the issue are really calling for a more comprehensive strategy that would address those conditions and also strengthen local governments, etc. Meanwhile, last night in the GOP debate, the prevailing attitude was that the U.S. can somehow bomb their way out of everything. And that sounds ridiculous, but I don't think it's pure incompetence either. I think it comes from a set of priorities that result from a military-industrial complex that Eisenhower and even Colin Powell criticized.
Well, let's turn to that debate. The first presidential debate ahead of the 2016 elections took place last night. The 10 most popular Republican hopefuls debated one another at a live televised event sponsored by Fox News. While Donald Trump made the most colorful statements, such as defending his anti-Latino racism, most media reports concluded that there was no clear winner. Senator Rand Paul and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie sparred with one another. Ohio Governor John Kasich, who is a newcomer to the field of hopefuls, came away appearing relatively sane. And the sole woman in the group, Carly Fiorina, also emerged as somewhat promising. Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, who had polled among the top 3 candidates alongside Trump, did not shine last night. Mike Huckabee and Marco Rubio, who have slipped in the polls, reiterated their opposition to women's reproductive rights. Well, Chenjerai, Republican primaries are generally where the crazy usually emerges clearly. What did you make of last night's debate?
Well, I think the crazy came out and the bigotry came out. I mean, here's a party who claims to be trying to change its view of being a bigoted party, and yet Donald Trump's bigotry, sexism was explicitly on display. The whole conversation was about being scared of hugging Obama. We're scared of Muslims. We're scared of women, everybody. So it's really interesting. I was surprised to see that healthcare was not talked about very much, since that has been like a key focus of the GOP, repealing Obamacare. That only came up a couple of times in the debate. So I think this was really, it made for great television. And unfortunately, Fox has a policy of making, high ratings, tense television, politically charged television that unfortunately miseducates a huge section of the public.
And finally, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has released its monthly jobs report for July. The highly anticipated report shows that the economy added 215,000 new jobs last month. But the official unemployment rate remains relatively high at 5.3%. The fields of construction and manufacturing added the most jobs. Average hourly earnings rose very slightly by 0.2%. According to Reuters, quote, wage growth has been disappointingly slow, but tightening labor market conditions and decisions by several state and local governments to raise their minimum wage have fueled expectations of a pickup. The Federal Reserve is expected to increase interest rates in September based on this report. Well, Chenjerai, is this report enough to make you optimistic about the future of the U.S. economy?
I'm sorry to say it's not. Let's be clear. We're experiencing more than wealth and income inequality than any time in the 1920s. And, these job reports are tricky because people in the GOP love to use them to somehow conclude that their policies would have been better for the economy than Obama's policies. But I think when we talk about unemployment, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a variety of different kinds of reports. And I think a better one to look at is the U6 rate, which includes marginally attached workers, part-time workers, and people, like a more expansive view of the civilian labor force. And when we look at that rate, it's a lot higher than 5.3%. I think, it's more like 10, it dipped down to like 10%. And you really start to get the idea that this economy is suffering, and I think we're going to have to really change things at a structural level.
Well, Chenjerai, thank you as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. He's our daily newsflash guest expert. This is Uprising. By the way, you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/uprisingradio, as well as on Twitter, twitter.com/uprisingradio. We post every day, and we'd love for you to keep track of everything that we do on this program. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. August 6th marked the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, a historic piece of legislation that was one of the hard-won victories of the civil rights movement. Just hours before the first Republican presidential debate, President Obama addressed the nation in a video conference yesterday to mark the anniversary. Alongside him were Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Representative John Lewis. Mr. Lewis was a prominent figure in the fight for voting rights. It is a sad state of affairs in the nation that the voting rights of people of color and poor people 50 years later are still under threat. The Supreme Court in 2013 ruled against a major section of the VRA that helped to enforce the right to vote. Earlier this week, a federal appeals court struck down a controversial Texas voter ID law, saying it was discriminatory against people of color, and several other states, such as North Carolina, are seeing their controversial voting laws being challenged. Joining me today to discuss the state of voting rights, as well as a history that led us to where we are, is Ari Berman. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine and an investigative journalism fellow at the Nation Institute. His new book is called Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. He has written extensively about American politics, civil rights, and the intersection of money and politics. His stories have appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. His first book was entitled Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. Welcome to Uprising, Ari.
Thanks for having me back, Sonali.
Well, first, how historic was the Voting Rights Act when it was passed and signed in 1965? Did the police violence against civil rights marches in places like Selma, Alabama, generate so much sympathy for the civil rights movement that it sort of lent momentum for that bill to pass?
Yeah, that's absolutely what happened, and it was an incredibly historic piece of legislation. Even at the time, I think everyone knew how consequential this was, and you have to remember, Congress passed 3 Civil Rights Acts before the Voting Rights Act. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, of 1960, and of 1964, and none of them solved the problem of voting discrimination. And indeed, we saw in Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote in early 1965. The violence in Selma, not just in Selma, but in Mississippi and all across the South, was indicative of how hard the struggle was and how much blood was shed for the Voting Rights Act. And so the Voting Rights Act was a culmination of decades of struggle to win this right. And also, it was a recognition that the Voting Rights Act had to try to solve this problem once and for all, that Congress couldn't pass a Voting Rights Act of 1966 and 1967 and 1968 like they had done with the previous civil rights laws. There had to be one Voting Rights Act. It had to address the problem, and it had to be enforced.
I want to play an excerpt of Lyndon B. Johnson giving a speech in support of voting rights and the specific bill in question. Let's watch this incredible and actually quite historic speech.
But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
How important, Ari Berman, was this speech, and particularly those last few words?
So I actually couldn't hear the speech because I'm on Skype.
I'm sorry.
But I'm very familiar with President Johnson's speech. Was it the one from March where he introduced the Voting Rights Act, or the one from August where he signed it?
The one where he basically used those three words, "we shall overcome."
Yeah. So that was his address to the Congress in March 1965. 8 days after Bloody Sunday in Selma. And what Johnson did is he used the full force of the presidency, the full bully pulpit. He called a joint session of Congress, which was a very rare occasion, usually reserved for things like the State of the Union, to make not just the political case for the Voting Rights Act, but more importantly, the moral case for the Voting Rights Act, where he basically said, it is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote. So what he was doing was he was taking all the anger, all the outrage that was generated from Selma and saying that we have to do something profound about this problem, that this problem is plaguing our democracy, that we actually can't be a democracy as long as millions of people are denied the right to vote. And so I think that is one of the most powerful and consequential speeches ever delivered by an American president.
Now, black voters were kept away from the ballot box in a variety of ways before the Voting Rights Act was enacted. There were poll taxes, and there were, of course, the literacy tests. How specifically did the Voting Rights Act dismantle those myriad ways in which African Americans were kept from voting?
Well, it was so effective because it dismantled them overnight. So it basically drew a formula that said, if you were a southern state that had used the literacy test or a similar device to prevent African Americans voting, that test was abolished after the Voting Rights Act was passed. So literacy tests were overturned overnight in places like Alabama. The other thing it did is it authorized the Attorney General to file suits against the poll tax. They knew they were going to win this case in court, so they didn't need to challenge it legislatively, but nonetheless it empowered the Attorney General to do this on a fast-track basis. Then what it did is it sent federal examiners to the South to actually register voters, to make the promise of the act real. And so what you saw is that days after the act passed, there were federal examiners all across the South who were registering African American voters in the most segregated areas in the country, where basically no African Americans had been registered for decades. And so you saw hundreds and then thousands and eventually millions of voters registered. And then the federal government stayed, and the Justice Department and other agencies monitored elections to make sure they weren't stolen, so that these newly registered voters would actually have a real say in the process, that their votes would actually be counted. And that was no small issue in places like Selma, where in fact opponents to the VRA did try to stuff ballot boxes and steal elections and not count votes after the VRA, but they were prevented from doing so. And then the kind of final piece of the Voting Rights Act was that it said to those states with the worst histories of voting discrimination, places like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, that they had to approve their voting changes with the federal government so that they wouldn't be able to discriminate in the future. And that's what made the Voting Rights Act so powerful, that it actually preemptively stopped voting discrimination in the places where that discrimination was most likely to occur.
And then 10 years later, President Ford signed an amendment to the Voting Rights Act. That was in 1975. What did that amendment entail?
Well, this was a really broad expansion of the Voting Rights Act. What happened was the temporary provisions of the Act were due to expire first in 1970, and then the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized. And in 1970, it was signed by Richard Nixon, despite his opposition to the VRA. And that extension abolished literacy tests nationwide and lowered the voting age to 18. So that was the first consequential reauthorization. Then it was due to expire again in 1975, and it was reauthorized again. What happened in that reauthorization is the act was expanded to protect language minority groups. So Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, any variety of Americans who spoke a language other than English. And it did two things. It required that ballots were printed in multiple languages in places where there was a large concentration of language minority voters. And that was really important because English-only ballots were functioning as de facto literacy tests in a lot of places. The second thing it did is it forced those states where there was a large concentration of language minority voters with a long history of discrimination, so a place like Texas, for example, to actually also have to approve its voting changes with the federal government. So states like Arizona and then Texas were covered under what became known as Section 5 of the Act. And that was huge because Texas actually became the most rampant violator of the Voting Rights Act in the decades that followed. So covering such a huge state like Texas and also expanding protections to a whole much wider range of Americans was really, really powerful.
And I want to get to what Texas is up to today, but in general, let's talk about where the wave of attacks against the voting rights legally at the state level in particular, where it began. I mean, today we see so many states where Republicans are leading the charge using a false premise of voter fraud to make it harder for people to vote. I guess it's no longer PC to just come straight out and say they would like for people of color to not vote. But when did this sort of latest modern wave of attacks against voting rights begin?
So what I show in my book is that there's a very long history of attacks to the VRA. And in fact, the VRA was attacked from the very days it was passed all the way through to the present. But you're absolutely right that there was a dramatic escalation of attacks on voting rights following Barack Obama's election. And I think a lot of people thought that Obama's election was going to end the discussion about voting rights because it was the culmination of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, the Voting Rights Act was passed to make someone like Barack Obama possible, to make his presidency possible. And we saw this incredible coalition of young voters, minority voters, just a wide range of Americans that were empowered by the VRA to elect the president. But what happened is there was a significant backlash to that progress. And after all these states flipped from blue to red in 2010, we saw tons of states, half the states in the country, passed new voting restrictions. And these were things like voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, elimination of same-day registration, shutting down voter registration drives, purging the voting rolls, preventing felons from voting. And this happened, in key swing states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio. And what was so notable about it was how widespread it was, and the fact that it was happening not just in the South, but also in the North. That in fact, voter suppression, Southern-bred voter suppression, the kind of voter suppression that we saw in the 1960s, was taking new forms, more sophisticated forms, more subtle forms, and it was spreading all across the country. And so the very evil that the Voting Rights Act was meant to stop, in fact, spread after what was in many ways the biggest victory for the VRA, the election of President Obama.
And then in 2013, the Supreme Court struck, and it struck down a very important section of the Voting Rights Act. And we covered this quite a bit, but summarize for our audience how the Supreme Court's decision lent momentum to the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, it's very ironic, as you mentioned, that the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act at the very moment when there was this dramatic escalation of attacks on voting rights. So if anything, the Voting Rights Act should have been expanded after the attacks on voting rights, and instead it was severely contracted by the Supreme Court. And what they said is they struck down the formula that covered all those states with a long history of voting discrimination and said that those states had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And the Supreme Court basically said that that was an outdated concept, that it violated state sovereignty, and that either states like Alabama were not discriminating anymore, or other states were discriminating, so Alabama couldn't be treated differently. And what the Supreme Court was essentially saying was, if you can't catch everybody, you can't catch anybody, essentially. And so that decision has led to a new wave of voter suppression. What it's meant is that, laws that were previously blocked, like Texas's voter ID law, which I'm sure we'll discuss more, were allowed to go into effect. New states like North Carolina that were previously subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act passed new restrictions. It also made it harder to challenge laws elsewhere, because what happens in the voting rights sphere is when one state does something, if one state's allowed to have a restrictive new law go into effect, that empowers other states to want to do it. And so what we saw is in states like Wisconsin, for example, the courts were a lot less hospitable to blocking voting rights than they were before the Supreme Court's decision.
And North Carolina is another place where initially actually a voter ID law, but one that had even broader implications about ending same-day registration, etc., was in place. But then it is being challenged right now by groups like the NAACP and the ACLU. Are people able to fight back, or are they effectively fighting back to try to preserve, at least state by state, some semblance of rights for people?
Well, they are fighting back, and they're fighting back using the existing tools of the Voting Rights Act. But it's a much tougher fight, because in North Carolina, which is a good case study, you had a law that initially was a strict voter ID law, but not the strictest in the country. And then after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, that voter ID law became a lot stricter, and they added a ton of other things to the bill that made it harder to vote. So cutting early voting, eliminating same-day registration, eliminating pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, et cetera, et cetera. That law would have had to, under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, been approved by the federal government or the federal courts. And I have no doubt in my mind that it would have been blocked, because there was clear evidence that African Americans and other minorities were worse off under the bill. But instead, what's happened is this law was allowed to go into effect, and it's now being challenged under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, Section 2 applies nationwide unlike Section 5. It is permanent. The problem with Section 2 is it puts the burden of proof on plaintiffs, so those who are facing discrimination, to try to challenge these laws. That's a very lengthy process. There's a very difficult burden they have to show. So these lawsuits are incredibly time-consuming. They're incredibly expensive. No matter what happens, they get appealed. So there was already this whole long preliminary injunction process last year. Now there's been a full trial. It just happened in Winston-Salem over a 3-week period. And I mean, it's an exhaustive process. I just saw a bunch of lawyers from North Carolina yesterday, and they were spent after this, and they said, it really shouldn't be this difficult to stop a law that everyone knew was discriminatory.
And then you have the state of Oregon, which is bucking the trend and actually expanding voter rights and protecting them, and at least at their state level. Under Governor Kate Brown, Oregon passed what may be, I think, the most progressive voting law in the nation, where essentially you are automatically registered to vote unless you opt out to do so. Kids who turn 18 and get their driver's licenses are automatically registered. Can this be, how important is this law, and can it be a model for the rest of the nation?
It's extremely important. Yes, it can be a model. Automatic voter registration nationwide would add 50 million people to the voting rolls. And what we know is that once you're on the voting rolls, you're very likely to actually vote. So 80% of those people that are registered actually vote. And so the problem that we have is not that people who are registered don't vote, it's that we don't have people who are registered, is one of the foremost problems in American society. And so this idea that it should be on the government, not the individual, to register voters, I think is a very smart thing, because the government requires you to do all sorts of things, like enroll in the Selective Service when you're 18, and there's no reason why you couldn't get a registration card when you're 18 as well. And what I find hopeful about this process is that as there is an attack on voting rights in many states, states that are more progressive are realizing they have to get serious about expanding voting rights. So automatic voter registration is being considered in California, for example. the largest of all the blue states. California is also considering doing other reforms. They have online voter registration now. They just had a law that enfranchised 60 to 70,000 ex-felons. And so I think you're seeing some movement among states like California, like Oregon. I'd like to see more movement. Places like New York, where I live, don't have early voting, don't have same-day registration. This is ridiculous to me. Those places that are governed by more moderate leaders have to get serious about expanding voting rights, because voting rights are being contracted in so many other places.
Now, of course, a big part of the problem more than 50 years ago, when the need for a federal voting rights was, clear, was that states were able to individually decide how to allow people to vote and how not to allow them to vote. And it feels like we're going back in that same direction. So ultimately, if we do want to preserve voting rights, doesn't there need to be some kind of federal expansion, preservation, etc., an undoing of the Supreme Court decision, but in general, a federal level protection of voting rights? But of course, the likelihood of that with our current setup seems, and our current breakdown in Congress seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah, this Congress can't do anything. They can barely name a post office. But if you're talking about what needs to be done, you're absolutely right that the Voting Rights Act needs to be restored, and it needs to be modernized so that it doesn't just cover the worst violators, but it also covers those new practices that lead to discrimination, things like voter ID laws and the like. And the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015, which was introduced in the Senate by Patrick Leahy and in the House by John Lewis and a bunch of other Congress people, I think it would be a good start to this problem. The other thing the Congress needs to do is pass federal election reform. And that doesn't mean that they have to tell states exactly how to run their elections, but there needs to be some basic standards so that people don't wait in line a long time to vote. So that's voting's not too difficult, that there's a minimum thing of either same-day registration or early voting or something to give people more opportunities so they don't just have to show up on a Tuesday from 8 to 6 and vote. And I think, one of the things I'm worried about, and you mentioned this in your question, is that we are headed towards a two-tiered electoral system where blue states are expanding voting rights and red states are contracting voting rights. And I think that's a very unfortunate situation, because that means millions of Americans are going to have their voting rights diminished.
Finally, Ari, I'm wondering if you saw the video conference that President Obama, Loretta Lynch, and John Lewis gave yesterday in talking about voting rights from, his bully pulpit as president. How strongly is the president, the White House, etc., fighting for voting rights? Not that it might make much difference among Republicans, but at least to make this a national issue certainly seems very important.
Yeah, well, I did see it. I was actually in the room when it happened.
Okay.
Because I was on a panel about the Voting Rights Act after that, which was pretty cool. And basically, I think it was important. The president talked about the need for the Voting Rights Act, and what he said is, he called out opponents of the VRA and those who are making it harder to vote. And he said, everyone believes in the right to vote theoretically. Everyone honors the struggles of Selma theoretically, but in practice, people are dishonoring the Voting Rights Act and dishonoring Selma by gutting it and making it harder to vote. So I would hope that the White House continues to push this. They said that they were going to make September 22nd National Voter Registration Day. I think that's really important. I think the president has a unique role to play here as the first Black president to really talk about the importance of voting rights, to keep this issue out there. I thought it was disheartening that the topic didn't come up in the first GOP debate. The first GOP debate was on the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we had a bunch of candidates up there who have come out in favor of laws that make it harder to vote. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, Ted Cruz in Texas, Chris Christie in New Jersey. And they should have been called out on that. And obviously this was Fox News, this was Republican primary viewers. But there has to be a political cost to opposing voting rights. And the way there is a political cost to doing so is that the issue gets raised not just by the president, supporters of voting rights, but that opponents of voting rights get called out on it. And so I thought it was unfortunate that the moderators of that debate asked the candidates about God and the role that Jesus played in their life, and not about the anniversary of the VRA and all these other related issues.
Well, Ari, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for the work that you've done in putting this very important book together. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sonali.
My guest is Ari Berman. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine and an investigative journalism fellow at the Nation Institute. His new book is called Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. May 13th of this year marked the 30th anniversary of the only aerial police bombing on U.S. soil, an event, sadly, most Americans have never heard of. Philadelphia police dropped a bomb on top of a house inhabited by members of an African-American political organization named MOVE in a predominantly black neighborhood. 11 people were killed, among them 5 children. Only 2 people survived, a 13-year-old boy named Michael Ward, who died 2 years ago after years of therapy for the trauma he suffered, and a woman named Ramona Africa, who joins me in studio today. She is in Los Angeles, where this program is produced, to speak at an event that is screening a documentary about the 1985 MOVE house bombing called Let the Fire Burn. Ramona Africa is also the Minister of Communication for the MOVE organization, and I'm so honored to welcome her to our show. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're a figure whose name I have seen, who I have read about, who I have talked about on my program.
Don't fall for the hype.
For many years. And so for me, this is amazing to be sitting with you in a studio to talk about such a historic event that, as I said, most Americans still have never heard of. Why is it that so many Americans outside of progressive movements and outside of African American communities have not heard about what happened in 1985?
Well, it's very simple, actually. People have not heard about the bombing because government officials cannot justify it any kind of way. I mean, they burned babies alive. They cannot justify that. So officials do what they generally do. They manipulate a willing media to just keep it quiet. You know, don't talk about it. Don't do anything about it. And that's why a lot of people have not heard about it.
This May, because it was the 30th anniversary, so it was a prominent date, there was some media coverage. The NPR did a lengthy piece on it, and you joined others to commemorate it in Philadelphia. Do you think that 30 years later there is a little bit more coverage, a little bit more awareness?
I absolutely do. And that is buttressed by the fact that people from all over the country and outside of the country, people came from France to be part of our program. It was amazing even to me, even though I was expecting a lot of people, but absolutely 30 years later, more people, know about what happened to MOVE, know about MOVE, and are motivated enough to come out to support MOVE.
You didn't say this, but I think it is important to just come out and say the fact that the bombing was aimed at an African-American neighborhood against an African-American organization has a lot to do with why it's not better known. Many more Americans know about the Waco issue and incident. But, you know, part of it also is, I think, the fact that this is part of our ongoing blindness on the issue of racism.
Well, absolutely. Let me first say, however, that MOVE is what's called multiracial. There are white people in MOVE, Spanish people in MOVE. There have been Jewish people in MOVE.
But the leadership is predominantly Historically.
Move is predominantly black, African American. So to respond to your question, absolutely, this never would have happened in a predominantly white neighborhood with a predominantly white organization. Never would have happened.
Tell us about John Africa, the founder of Move. His name has sort of reached mythic proportions, right, these days. Who was he, and what was his motivation?
Okay. His name has reached those proportions, I believe, most likely because John Africa represents what's right, what is godly. And you don't find that, out there. People are searching for that. But the bottom line is John Africa is a being that brought truth, that brought honesty, a respect for life. The belief that John Africa have given Move members is that life is the priority. Without categorization, we're talking about human life, animal life, plant life, the water we must have, the air we must have, the earth we must have to grow food to feed us, the sun that warms the earth. Life is the priority, and nothing comes before life. And anything that opposes life is to be brought down, shut down for good, because life is the priority.
So that was the basis of
That's the basis.
sort of beliefs and system that Move has been founded on.
And it's what put us in direct conflict with this system, that doesn't care about life at all, who barters the air for air pollution, poisons the water that we must have, puts, toxic waste in the earth that feeds us.
So your personal experience and the experience of many Move members exemplifies an issue that has finally, after a very long time in the U.S., perhaps not since the 90s, become a center stage, and that is the issue of police brutality. What happened to Move was the worst expression of police brutality, the most violent example of police brutality in the history of the United States. How do you view what is happening today with the Black Lives Matter movement, given the long history that you have with being the target of police brutality?
Well, I will tell you, the way you describe the bombing of me and my family is accurate. And one of the reasons that things are so out of control today, with cops just killing people at random on the street, is because, and I say one of the reasons, is because the response that should have come from the people after the bombing wasn't what it should have been.
That should have been the last time that cops got away with doing what
Well,
they did.
at least they should have been a lot more leery.
And nobody was
reserved.
ever held accountable for that bombing, right?
Absolutely.
That's
I mean,
amazing.
how do you allow that to happen? It doesn't matter if you care about Move, if you like Move. I've said it over and over again. We know people have issues with Move. Some people have issues with Move. But get over it. Let's deal with the overwhelming issue here. They dropped a bomb on a row house. That bomb ignited a fire. The firefighters who were there from the beginning, who were the first mode of attack on Move with their water hoses, their deluge hoses, when there was a fire, they didn't put any water on it, made no attempt to put it out. Now, when have you ever heard of firefighters being at a fire scene, knowing there are men, women, babies, animals in that dwelling, and they stand by and make a decision not to let the fire, not to put the fire out. I don't know who exactly suggested that, gave the order or whatever, but a crime scene, a scene dealing with police is one thing, but once there is a fire, that is the jurisdiction of the fire commissioner, and so the onus of it all has to fall on him.
And that's why the documentary about what happened in 1985 is entitled Let the Fire Burn.
Absolutely.
And in fact, this is an amazing documentary produced a couple of years ago by Zeitgeist Films. I want to play a trailer for our audience of this documentary.
Okay.
It's called...
I just have to make a point. When we realized our home was on fire, we immediately attempted to get our children, our animals, and ourselves out of that blazing inferno. The instant the cops could see us trying to come out, and we were hollering that we're coming out, we're bringing the children out, the children were hollering, we're coming out, they're bringing us out. The instant the cops could see us, we were met with a barrage of police gunfire.
Yeah.
They didn't intend for anybody to survive that confrontation.
Yeah. Let the Fire Burn is the name of the documentary that encompasses and captures what happened 30 years ago, May 13th, 1985. Let's watch the trailer.
May 13th, 1985. Years of conflict between the city of Philadelphia and a small urban group known as MOVE ended in a violent day-long encounter. It was one of the most devastating days in the modern history of this city.
The big story tonight is the effort to evict MOVE. The effort has turned into a disaster. Can you describe the philosophy of MOVE?
We were being taught about the corruption in this system.
The system, the establishment, you.
Did you consider the MOVE organization to be a terrorist group?
People who threaten to shoot and kill neighbors, police. I think that's a pretty adequate description of the word terrorist.
Where is it written that we could not have a religion of our own?
The system had one intention, to either kill MOVE people or to put us in prison as long as possible. It's just that simple.
More than 36 Philadelphia policemen surrounded the building after a MOVE member was spotted on the roof wearing a hooded mask and carrying a shotgun.
We intend to seize control of the house. We will do it by any means necessary.
Every one of us knew that someone was going to die.
Did you have a concern that the people inside that house might be in physical danger?
Excuse me, to
Yes, ma'am.
ask me, what were we concerned is complete insanity.
There has just been a huge explosion here. We don't know what it means, but it just shook the whole place. It was a huge blast.
Did it ever occur to you that this might have been a dangerous device?
Yes, ma'am.
The fire got real heavy, and we couldn't breathe. Then that's when we started yelling.
What did you say? What did you yell?
We want to come out.
There's no one that I know in city government that would intentionally go out there to burn those people to death. There's no one that I know of could do that.
I remember as soon as I scooped him up, he said to me, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me."
And that's a trailer for the documentary Let the Fire Burn about the 1985 firebombing of the MOVE House in Philadelphia. And joining me in studio today is Ramona Africa, the sole surviving adult member of that firebombing. And she's also the Minister of Communication of the MOVE organization. This film is very important in showing the world what happened 30 years ago, because although there was local coverage in Philadelphia, there wasn't a sort of a single document that encompassed a lot of what happened in one place. How important has this film been as a tool to raise awareness?
It's been pretty good. I have to admit that the filmmaker Jason Oster, he came to Philadelphia and did 2 extensive interviews with me According to him, he interviewed other people as well. And in the end, he decided not to use any of the interviews. There's a short clip of information from me, but it wasn't from the interviews that he did. And he made the decision to use archival footage from the commission hearings, etc., rather than any current interviews. I would have preferred him to use current information and interviews, but it's his movie, his film.
Right.
I think it has gone a long way toward waking people up, because I get emails almost any time the film is screened anywhere in the country. I end up getting emails and finding out that it's screened here, screened there, etc. It is also international. I know it was screened in Germany. While the international community seems much more aware than the U.S. community, I've been invited literally all over the world, all over Western Europe, Amsterdam, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain. I've been to South America. My sister went to Cuba. One of our supporters went to Africa, to Durban, for the Congress Convention on Racism, etc. We've been all over. The international community seems to be much more on target than the U.S. community.
And Ramona, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, you talked about how when people tried to leave the burning building, they were met with gunfire. You and one other person survived, a 13-year-old boy who sadly died 2 years ago. You were remarkably then charged yourself with inciting riot and other related charges. So the trauma that you went through and simply dealing with the harrowing nature of what was done to you
and my family
and your family, and then on top of that, you were criminalized. This is part of the system of police brutality, which works hand in hand with the criminal justice system, to say that, when people are beaten up or harmed in any way, they're then turned around and charged with resisting arrest or assault or whatever, in this case, inciting riot. Tell us a little bit about the aftermath of the bombing.
One thing that people are probably not aware of is that Police Commissioner Gregory Sambor came out to our home with 4 warrants for 4 of us, me and 3 of my sisters and brothers. The warrants allege disorderly conduct. I think they threw in terroristic threats, which was ridiculous, for an event that had happened 2 weeks earlier, which was a non-event. Anyway, after my arrest and when I began the court process, the warrants that they came out there with, the charges and the warrants that they came out there with, were dismissed. They were found to have no basis to them. They were dismissed. Now, it seems to me that if your reason for being out there was dismissed, found to be invalid and had no basis to it, how can anything coming from you being out there and attacking us be valid? They charged me, before the original warrants were thrown out, they charged me with everything that they did. They charged me with possession of explosives. I didn't have a bomb or any explosives. They did. They charged me with arson. I didn't start a fire. Their bomb started a fire. They charged me with risking and causing a catastrophe. Me and my family were in our home minding our business when they came out there. Everything that they did, they charged me with. In the end, despite the laundry list of charges, I was convicted and sentenced for riot. Now, I rioted at my own home, in my own house, I was sentenced to 16 months to 7 years. And when my 16-month sentence was up, I was interviewed by the parole board. Parole board told me that they were willing to parole me with one special condition, that I sever all ties with my MOVE family. I could not have any contact with any MOVE person. Now,
which goes to show that this was the idea of MOVE
exactly
that they were
that
opposed
was the
to.
issue. They didn't ask me to agree not to riot, not to participate in any demonstrations.
We're supposed
or
to have
whatever.
freedom of religion in the U.S.
Yes,
that the right wing especially
supposed to.
constantly holds up. Wow. So what happened? What did you do?
I told them they could take that special condition and stick it. I was not agreeing to that. When they tried that with several of my other MOVE sisters and brothers, nobody accepted that stipulation. So I ended up doing the whole 7 years. My sister Sue Africa, one of our white members, did 12 years. You know, my sister Alberta Africa did her full 7. My brother Mo Africa did his full 5
Meanwhile,
years.
nobody was ever charged or convicted
Not
or
one
sentenced
single
for
person.
the firebombing of the MOVE house.
Not one. But, I mean, you see it today.
Yeah.
I mean, Darren Wilson wasn't prosecuted for killing Michael
Exactly.
Brown. You know, it's the order
There have been a
of the
few
day.
charges over the past year in Baltimore and most recently in Cincinnati, but still no actual convictions. We'll see how those
Exactly.
trials play out. One of the people that I want to talk about with you, Ramona, that you have done a lot of support for, who is a very prominent figure on our program, is Mumia Abu-Jamal. We routinely play his commentaries. He's been a longtime ally of MOVE, and like you and other MOVE members, he was also a victim of police brutality and was also incarcerated and criminalized. He's currently struggling for his life in prison, and we've been covering his medical struggles. It appears that he has now been diagnosed with hepatitis C, but he's not being treated for it.
Let me clarify something. According to the medical documents that his attorneys have gotten, prison officials have known that Mumia had active hepatitis C since 2012. You're talking about 3 years.
And it hasn't been treated.
Has not been treated.
And this is a huge problem, a rampant problem in our prison system where prisoners getting infected with hepatitis
Absolutely,
C.
but I need to make something clear here. Daniel Faulkner, the cop that Mumia is accused of killing, his widow, Maureen Faulkner, when Mumia's death sentence was overturned and he was given an outrageous life in prison without parole, Maureen Faulkner was livid. And she said, well, now that he's not so isolated and it's easier to get to, maybe he'll get what he deserves now.
Wow.
Now, you can't get any clearer than that. Everybody knows what she's talking about. When Mumia was on death row for 30 years, he didn't get sick like that. He had a problem with his feet swelling up sometimes every now and then. But none of this. How is it that when he gets into general population, he has all these problems?
And a lot of his supporters have felt that essentially because they couldn't execute him, they're trying other means of medical negligence or something even more nefarious. And there's no way right now for us to find out about that.
Well, it's pretty clear. I mean, if they were interested at all, as they should be, in Mumia's welfare, his health and medical welfare, I mean, all they had to do was say yes to the community's demand to have outside doctors come in and examine Mumia and treat him. We're willing to pay for that. We're willing to foot the bill. Minister Louis Farrakhan said he would fly in the doctors of Mumia's choice and, you know, kick in a portion of the medical expenses.
And there were crowdfunding campaigns where people donated money.
Right, right. You know, so what is their problem? They're not being asked to pay for anything. They want to kill him. They're intent on killing him.
Well, we've done what we can to keep his voice on the air by airing his commentaries, which can be found at prisonradio.org. Finally, we've touched upon a little bit of this, but in the past year, the Black Lives Matter movement has finally managed to raise, in a public way and in a mainstream way, consciousness among the general public about police brutality against African Americans and unarmed people in particular. Something that has, of course, been a problem right from the beginning, but is only now kind of breaking into the public consciousness in the same way that the Rodney King beating did in 1992. How hopeful are you today? You're a veteran of these struggles against police brutality. Are you hopeful that there is some change happening on the awareness front? We're coming upon, and actually it's August. This is a very important month. A lot of folks refer to August as Black August. Yes. Any last thoughts on those issues?
Absolutely. I was just in Cleveland for the Black Lives Movement
the gathering.
Conference. Yes. Yeah. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed with several things. One, there was a ton of young people there. And these are young people that are ready and willing to do something. They don't want to hear a lot of words. They want information. They listen to elders, as you say, veterans of the struggle. They listen to what, was said. They ask questions, and they're ready to step up and to really crystallize that. The people I was traveling with, we left Cleveland around 12 o'clock on that Sunday, the last day of the conference. En route home, we found out that the cops had stopped this young man, 14 years old, said he was intoxicated. And, the people, it was some people outside of the student center where the conference was, and they stepped right up. They surrounded the police car, wouldn't let them take this boy away till his mother got there, and they put so much pressure, showed such a, show of strength that they released that boy to his mother, to his parents. They didn't take him into custody.
Well, Ramona,
it's the power of the people.
Exactly. There you go. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's been an honor to have you here to talk about history and contemporary politics.
Thank you for having me. On the Move. Long live all of our freedom fighters. Long live revolution. Long live Earth First, the Earth Liberation Front, the Animal Liberation Front. Long live all of those who fight for what is right.
Thank you so
much. Long
much.
live John Africa.
My guest is Ramona Africa, the sole survivor of the 1985 MOVE bombing, Minister of Communication for the MOVE organization. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Kiana Turner is our production coordinator, visual editor, and audio engineer, along with Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.